Hey there, everyone. This is Joe Laloon, and I've got something incredible to share with you. If you're looking to supercharge your health, I've discovered a game changer. It's called Magnesium Breakthrough from Bioptimizers. I've personally been using Magnesium Breakthrough and recommending it to everyone, clients, friends, and family. The first day I tried it, I felt a noticeable difference compared to other magnesium supplements that I've used in the past. Now, here's the thing about magnesium. It's not just about taking more of it. There are different types, each crucial for specific functions in your body. Magnesium chelate, citrate, biglycinate, malate, sucrosomial, taurate, and orotate. Magnesium Breakthrough gives you all of these forms in the optimum dose. The benefits are incredible, from promoting heart health and improving stress resilience to enhancing mood, cognitive function, and metabolic health. It even supports exercise performance and helps with better sleep quality. Let's face it, we can all use a boost in at least one of these, right? That's why I'm excited to share with you this exclusive offer. Head to the link in our show notes and use the code 3phase10, that's the number 3, PHASE10, for a fantastic 10% off your order. Don't miss out on this chance to upgrade virtually every function in your body. Try Magnesium Breakthrough today because your health deserves the best. What's up, everyone? This is Joe Laloon, and welcome back to the Three Phase Podcast. Today's guest is Brandon Kapelow. Brandon Kapelow is a visual artist from Wyoming whose credits span work as a director, photographer, and cinematographer. His focus is on exploring stories centered on real people and the challenges they face through their unique histories and cultures. As a suicide loss survivor at an early age, Brandon has a passion for exploring topics related to mental health. Outside of his creative practice, Brandon is a peer support group facilitator for individuals impacted by suicide loss. Based between LA, Vancouver, and Wyoming, Brandon's home is on the road, inspired by changing landscapes and the people that inhabit them. And today, we're talking about some of his new projects and the work that he's been doing to shine light on a darker subject. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and now, let's dive in.
The Three Phase Podcast is starting now.
We're rolling. How you doing today?
Here we are. All's well. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Brandon Kapelow, welcome to the Three Phase Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It's a bit more of an intense subject that I'm leading on. Recently, in the last couple months, you were involved in a new project, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right.
So run us down just a little bit about that most recent process of going and presenting what you've been working on.
Sure. Yeah, well, I guess maybe before I get into it, I'll tell a little bit about my background and sort of how I got into this work, because I think it will help kind of explain the thread that connects all these things together for me. And so when I was 12 years old, I lost my father, Stephen, to suicide, and it kind of set me on a path in my career and in my life where I really wanted to explore issues surrounding mental health. It just was something that became very personal and important to me. So I went on to pursue a career in filmmaking and photography. And so I kind of knew for a long time that I wanted to find ways to explore that subject matter in the work that I was doing. And it wasn't until the pandemic really that I had an opportunity to kind of step away from sort of early career building blocks and like really dedicate some serious time and focus on cultivating that kind of work. So for the last few years, I've really been trying to seek out as many opportunities as I can to just find and develop more stories around the topic of mental health and the various ways that it impacts us. So that led me to work on a piece that I did that was published in 2022 in Time Magazine on the issue of suicide in the American West. I grew up in Wyoming, so that was sort of the part of the country where I was seeing it having the most impact, and that region of the U.S. has the highest suicide rate in the country. So I was exploring it sort of as a local issue. And then the more recent project that I'm working on has to do with the use of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy in treating mental health conditions. And that's something that we shot in Idaho, which is also in that part of the American West where suicide rates are at their highest. So there is sort of like a unifying theme behind all this stuff. And for me, it really had to do with, not just mental health, but how does this affect specific parts of the country more disproportionately than others? And what are the circumstances in those areas that are causing those rates to be so much higher than, say, in other parts of the country?
Yeah. And so when you took film at film school, that was intentionally with like this purpose of seeking out these types of stories? Like you consciously had chosen it for that thing, you think, or was it maybe something else that you're interested in at the time?
Yes, it developed a little bit later, I think. I knew from a very early age that I wanted to be involved in issues surrounding mental health, and I was doing a lot of sort of like more volunteer-based work through high school and college in the mental health space, particularly with an organization called AFSP, which is the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I was working just as like a volunteer in various parts of that organization. And so it wasn't until a little bit later that I kind of recognized that I was walking these two parallel paths. Like one of them was doing this mental health stuff, and then the other was pursuing a career as a filmmaker. And then it was around the pandemic that I kind of realized that I wanted to merge those two paths together. Right. So that was sort of the timing of that.
And then, with the Time magazine release, which is worth going and finding for anybody listening to go and read and get a better understanding of where this is impacting the U.S. And looking at some of the numbers just in that article were so eye-opening for me, to see. I jotted a few of them down, but it was like 63.2 people per 100,000 are committing suicide in just one county, that Catron County. And you've had chances to go and visit those areas and speak with people, which I'm sure was an experience in itself, just to have people open up to you, right, and have these conversations. And it sounds like a lot of those people were holding a lot of that conversation in, maybe from like too much familiarity with their neighbors, because in a small county like that, you kind of know everybody, and they would be hesitant to open up about things like that. So maybe just tell us about a few of those experiences that you had. Maybe notably, I think Ron, is that his name?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I mean, the whole thesis behind that project, which is something that is an ongoing project for me, like the first chapter, as I see it, was the piece that was published in Time, but I'm currently working on a follow-up chapter that's in Alaska, and I'm kind of trying to visit all of the different most heavily impacted counties in the West, kind of to create a mosaic that explores this as like a regional issue. And also just to give a little more context to that statistic that you mentioned about the suicide rate in that place, the national average in the United States is about, it's just under 14 per 100,000. So when people hear 65, they may not know what that number means, but really it's about quadruple the national average. So it's pretty significant. Yeah. And across the American West, you can expect, the average suicide rate to be, anywhere between like 50% to 100% higher than the national average in most places. So it is a significant problem there. As far as the work that I was doing in New Mexico, I chose that place because it was the highest suicide rate in the lower 48 states, or in other words, like the contiguous mainland United States, so excluding Alaska and Hawaii. And that part of New Mexico was the most impacted by county. So I went there because I wanted to try to meet people who were kind of living at the heart of this problem, and try to get a better understanding of why is it that this region is having this occur so much. And I met a lot of really interesting people there. I tried to meet primarily people who had either been directly impacted by suicide, either as like attempt survivors or what we call suicide loss survivors, meaning a family member or a peer or friend or colleague of somebody who's died by suicide. And I also wanted to meet people who worked in professional populations that cater to those groups. So first responders, behavioral health experts, people of that sort of ilk. So I got to talk to a very wide range of people, but the one that you mentioned specifically, his name is Ron. He's a fourth generation rancher who attempted suicide. And his suicide attempt resulted in a lot of facial disfiguration that required some reconstructive surgeries. And it was a really powerful experience for me because my dad had a very similar set of circumstances. He had several suicide attempts over 5 years, and it wasn't until his fifth attempt that he actually passed away. So meeting Ron was really sort of like an opportunity for me to talk to somebody who had a very similar thought process, or perhaps, theoretically, to my dad, considering that my dad was, he died before I was really old enough to be able to have those kind of conversations with him. So it was really fascinating. And Ron became sort of like a focal point of that particular story because he really spoke to a lot of the cultural circumstances that perhaps explain why the West has this issue so much more than other places. And those things being, there's this really strong cultural stigma that exists in rural America. And I think in rural places kind of everywhere,
Generally.
honestly, where there's really this sense of, like rugged individualism, this like pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality, which historically was kind of a necessity in a lot of these places, like on the frontier or in the homesteading era, where there really wasn't a super strong system of support for anyone. Like you really did have to kind of count on yourself, and I think that really was baked into the culture in a lot of ways that really persists through to today. And in some ways, I think that the factors underlying that are also true to an extent, like the social safety net in a lot of rural places is not as strong as it is in urban settings. And, there aren't as many offerings in terms of like behavioral health services. And even in some of the places I was visiting, like just access to broadband,
Right.
and being able to access like telehealth, for example, was not an option for a lot of people. So it just really helped me understand a little bit more of sort of what the underlying factors are that might be driving this issue.
Yeah, and probably for someone who is a multi-generational rancher and their family's lived in that region for a long time, probably a lot of those strategies like pull yourself up by your bootstraps were useful strategies, meaning like it made them more prosperous, or it got them through more seasons or whatever. And it was actually a very useful tool for them because everyone was kind of living by those means. And now at this point, like in history, as things have changed, and maybe there's less industry in those regions, that kind of strategy isn't useful anymore, and is obviously not serving people. I mean, I'm making a bit of an assumption that is probably one of the reasons, is that through that area, most of that industry has been sort of decimated to some extent, whether it's like the car industry or farming industry or, whatever else goes on through there. Did that seem like the common thread in at least a few of those places that you visited?
Yeah, no doubt. And Ron spoke to that as well. I mean, ranching is a really big example in the West specifically. I mean, there's a lot of areas, particularly like in the high alpine areas of the West, where like farming is not as common and ranching is more the norm. And, ranching is definitely an industry that has been under a lot of duress over the last like decade or so. I mean, it's popularized in that show Yellowstone, for anybody who's seen that. That's sort of like the fictitious version of it, but there is some truth to that as well. And also a lot of these areas, had economies that were really built around natural resource extraction. So, whether that's fossil fuels or logging or things like that, where, yeah, exactly. And it really is sort of like this boom or bust economic system. So you have these places that are really prosperous for a couple decades, and then they really build up, a population base and sort of like a community around that. And then once those underlying sort of resources dry up or they go out of fashion, then all of a sudden there's all of these people living there and they don't really have an economic engine to keep them afloat. Right. So what you also notice in a lot of these places is that their populations are getting smaller and older. And I think there is a bit of a feeling of despair around that when you see all the young people moving away. People, again, are losing that livelihood. And it does kind of feel like there isn't a sense of like a light at the end of the tunnel as to how that trend is going to go away or reverse itself.
I'm always looking for ways to improve my performance in the gym and my performance in sleep. And one thing that I found that really helped me with that was magnesium breakthrough from Bioptimizers. I've been using it and recommending it to everyone, and the results speak for themselves. It's not just about taking more magnesium, it's about getting all the crucial types in one dose. With benefits like promoting heart health and improving stress resilience, it's a game changer. Use the code 3phase10, that's the number 3, PHASE10 for 10% off your order. Don't miss out on this chance to upgrade your health today. Yeah, and then like when you are kind of taking out the net of youth, there's also like less support in that system too, right? Like
Totally.
being in a metropolis and you have, kids or just a younger generation who's going into nursing and going into EMS and going into behavioral therapy and all those kind of things. Like those are also systems that are in place that would help support someone in the aging process, whether it's even if they don't have suicide attempts or mental health issues or anything like that. They just need support in aging too. So that was one thing that was like a bit, wouldn't have thought about that, because usually the stat or the bell of the stat is sort of for men is kind of 35 to 45 age range, and so you don't kind of think about the other ends of that, the bell curve. But reading the Time article just to see like it's pretty prevalent in older ages as well, where people maybe have sort of lost the will at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you think about it, even just in other ways, like in terms of like a medical system or an insurance system, like we really rely on this sort of pyramid shape where you have a bigger base of younger, healthier people at the bottom that are supporting a smaller population of less healthy people at the top, right? And so when that pyramid gets flipped upside down, the system comes under a lot of strain. And it becomes really difficult for a lot of these rural municipalities to actually be able to like fund and support a system like that.
Yeah.
Because it just becomes more expensive for everybody as well.
Yeah, and that's a pretty interesting thing, because there's a few countries now that are in that situation where their eldest group is a higher population than the younger group, and it will, like I think Japan and China is whether the numbers are correct or not, and then there's one other I know that I forget which one it is. Anyway, they're in that situation where there are more older people than there are younger. So it's kind of a bit of a microcosm version of that, but definitely not.
Japan also has one of the highest suicide rates in the world.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Do you think that is a similar, like there's a sort of correlation between the two? Do you think it's like that flipping of the pyramid has something to do with that?
I'm not sure, honestly. I'm not as well versed on the situation in Japan. I know that there's a lot of different variables that are unique to that place. Like they have a very unique historical, cultural relationship to the concept of suicide that plays out in a lot of ways. It's a place that I definitely want to learn more about, because it's also similar to the United States in the sense that it's a very developed country. And I think that is maybe a little bit counterintuitive to some people, that like more wealthy nations would have a higher suicide rate. But I think there definitely are some threads that connect those places. I'm not as well versed enough to talk about it.
The other thing that I was going to ask about, but you kind of touched on, was like just thinking about these rural areas, whether technology had made a positive impact on getting people more help. But as you said, there's even like these areas are so rural that the internet connection is actually not even good enough to sustain sort of video conversation or telehealth or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's changing. Like some of these places I've visited, it really is a patchwork, I would say. Like you don't necessarily have technology benefiting everyone equally, but you will have some individual people or businesses that will say invest in like Starlink, and they'll have access to like really high quality internet. So I think that's going to become more prevalent in some of these places, but it just hasn't been applied equally yet. Like for example, when I was in Alaska, there was I was talking to the vice principal of the school district there, and
Mhm.
he was telling me about how they've historically been paying for internet that is like 75 megabits for the entire school campus, and they're paying thousands of dollars a month for this. And then he personally has Starlink at home, and it's like 140 megabits, and he's paying $100 a month for it. So I think that technology will be pretty revolutionary for a lot of these places. But again, that was sort of like a private company making an innovation. It wasn't the government coming in. And despite there's been a lot of conversation in the United States, and I'm possibly, I would assume so in Canada as well, about like rural broadband access and trying to increase and put more funding into infrastructure for rural broadband. But we haven't really seen it play out yet in a major way. So
Yeah, even here, like in Winnipeg, if you take a 20-minute drive outside of the city
mhm,
limits, it's vastly different, right? The
mhm,
quality of internet is different. The access to it is different. You're going to be spending more to get it there, and a lot of what we rely on in Canada is like land driven fiber optic.
right.
So in order to get any decent quality, the fiber optic has to reach you, and they got to put it in the ground in order for it to get there. So there's quite a process and quite a lot of money spent on trying to actually get it into these different areas. But you can imagine, just like trying to build roads, you're basically doing
Yeah,
the same thing. You're building a web road to all these different areas. So there's certainly limitations, even in you know a Canadian city. It's basically the same scenario.
totally. Yeah, makes sense.
Um, with the Alaska trip, where there's some unique challenges there, and things that were maybe a little bit different than the Midwest, not in terms of like personalities or typography or anything like that, but in the challenge of suicide rate and how that's impacting that community.
Yeah, and I do want to clarify one thing there, which is that
Yeah.
the epicenter of suicide in the United States is the Mountain West, not the Midwest.
Oh, sorry.
Which no, it's fine. And a lot of people don't even know the difference between those two things. Like the Midwest usually refers to sort of like the area west of the East Coast near the Mississippi River, sort of like that flat, very agrarian part of the country. And the part of the country that I'm most focused on is it's known in sports as the Intermountain West. Really, it's that strip of like the Rocky Mountains. So,
Right.
uh, Wyoming, Montana, New Mexico, um, those very high altitude states, which is where suicide is most concentrated. So, just one small
Yeah.
clarification there. But Alaska really is kind of like an extension of that, but to an even greater extreme. Like that same mountain chain kind of carries up through Western Canada and into Alaska.
Hmm.
And you do notice, like in Northwest Canada, that there are issues with suicide as well, like in the Yukon and places like that.
Hmm.
But Alaska, I think, there are a lot of unique factors there. Certainly, like the region that I was focused on is on the west coast of Alaska, and it was the Yukon Kuskokwim Delta, which is sort of southwest coastal Alaska. And it's unique because it's only accessible by bush plane. You can't get there by any road system. So it does feel very, sort of isolated in a lot of ways from the rest of the world. And it was interesting to go there because you kind of see what are the commonalities between this place and, say, New Mexico, which, in terms of climate and location, dramatically different from Alaska. But there are a lot of similarities. There were also a lot of differences. The population in Alaska, in this area specifically, was a lot younger actually, and I think youth suicide was a much bigger driver there than in New Mexico, which was sort of the opposite end of the spectrum.
Hmm.
Obviously, climate-wise, it's a lot wetter and harsher than in New Mexico. You have a lot more extreme weather, which also kind of further fuels that issue of being isolated, since
Yeah.
planes are the only way in and out. And also, as one of the most indigenous parts of the United States by population, it's like over 90% indigenous demographically. So that was another, and that can be true in a lot of New Mexico as well. But in the specific county that I was in, it was a much less indigenous, like much more white population.
Yeah. And yeah, I can only imagine. Like I've been to a few northern or one specific northern community in Canada that was similar. Like you could only get in by plane. There used to be a train, and then it got shut down anyway. But you could kind of feel the isolated aspect of not really having a lot of options there. And I bet for youth that would be pretty prevalent with that age group, especially not having access to how quickly things are moving and changing, and the access to information that a lot of lower 48 youth will have. It would definitely feel like a bit of missing the boat on a lot of things that are going on.
Yeah, I think, two of the biggest themes that I encounter kind of time and time again are really hope and social connection, and like the absence of those things, right? So
Mm-hmm.
hopelessness and social isolation. Like a lot of these places are very sparsely populated. They're some of the lowest population density areas like in the country. And then, that sense of hope and hopelessness, like we talked a little bit about some of the economic factors that are driving a sense of like young people wanting to leave and go elsewhere. That's driving that as well. And just, lack of opportunity, lack of, um, seeing a really prosperous future for yourself. And also this, suicide contagion is a very, very real, serious problem. And
Yeah.
I think in a lot of these small places, everybody knows about everything that happens to everyone, good or
Yeah.
bad. So when there are suicides, that does have sort of a cascading effect on people. And, there are statistics that show that if you've experienced a suicide loss, that you yourself are 30% more likely to have suicidal ideation.
Mhm.
So there is sort of that very real social component as well that plays out in some of these smaller places too.
Yeah, I remember reading to one of the principals who they had just lost a student a few months prior. They were
Hmm.
kind of on high alert for that contagion to take off, and that's a pretty scary thing to think about for someone who's maybe not connected to this subject, like myself,
Hmm.
not directly connected to it. So to actually hear like there is this real cascade effect that happens in these communities, and for them to have basically like a contingency plan if that were to happen. Um, what were those kind of conversations like? Seeing more of the sort of outsource or the outcome of when an individual does take their own life, what happens in the community and in the families and things like that.
Yeah, I mean there's a lot to talk about there, but I think
Mm-hmm.
that it's first like having that understanding of the risks of suicide contagion. Like it's something that is very important when you're doing any sort of like the language that we use around it is super important, and the way that we report it in the media is also very, very critical. Like when I was doing my article, I worked very closely with um, the PR team at the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention to kind of work on like safe messaging guidelines.
Yeah.
I think we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but I'm currently doing a media fellowship with Stanford about this as well. And one of the people in the psychiatry department that I'm working with there, they have developed like a toolkit for people to um, report safely on issues around mental health, but more specifically around suicide. Uh, at the school level, I think that what they really try to do is like when there is a suicide, they will get the entire student body together, and they'll get like mental health professionals to come in and really do like evaluations with the students on a more one-on-one basis. And they do trainings. And one of the more effective programs that's been implemented like in the school context is this thing called natural helpers, which is essentially like a peer-based suicide prevention model where you have students who are trained in how to recognize the warning signs and how to have you know positive conversations with their peers that allow them to kind of open up in ways that they might not be comfortable doing with adults,
Right.
um, and to be able to recognize those things that adults might not be able to see as easily. So that's been a really effective model for a lot of these, rural areas in particular. And I think some schools have been able to implement that preventatively, and then for others, it's like they do it in response to like, unfortunately, like a suicide cluster or something like that.
Yeah.
So it kind of varies by the circumstances a little bit.
Yeah, that sounds like it would be a really important program to have, especially in these rural areas that have low access, and to like it would be
Totally.
challenging to bring in a professional, or bring speakers in on a regular basis if it was necessary, but to kind of use the community that you have to educate them on how to be a resource that is useful in the smaller communities and more rural communities.
Yeah, and
Um,
there's a similar program that they did a New York Times article about it. I think last year or maybe the year before, about it's called Comets, COMETS. That is kind of a similar type system, but more at the community level for all members of the community. And it's as simple as like training bartenders how to do that. You know what I mean? And like more people who are embedded in the everyday of the community who can get a little bit more of those skills, because the other challenge in some of these small places is that people, like, maybe they do have a single counselor in the town, but
yeah,
nobody wants to be seen coming in and out the front door of that place
right.
because they don't want to be perceived that way, and there is
Hmm.
that stigma. So I think there's this belief that if you can get more everyday people to be trained, that you can kind of get around that barrier,
Yeah.
and that people are more comfortable being perceived as just having an open dialogue with just everyday community members rather than being in a therapist's office or something like that.
Yeah, it's kind of like more of a net and less of a hook, and especially
Yeah, totally.
in a small community where, like you said, like everybody knows the good and the bad that's going on, and to be attached to a stigma, um, most people probably would want to avoid that, generally speaking. But I think that's especially like where people who are at risk are spending most of their time, to be able to have those skills to recognize it, and maybe talk down, or have like a conversation that's going to kind of move them away from the ideation of it. That's that's a positive thing to do. Like more,
Mm.
I agree. More people should have that, even in non-rural areas. To be in a city that there's still plenty of too much of it happening anyway. So to be sort of an ally in that system is critical, honestly.
Yeah, and it applies to urban set. It really applies everywhere. And look, like, I focus a lot on rural America, but suicide is a big problem in all of America.
Hmm.
It's like the 10th leading cause of death. That might not be the most current. It's either, it usually fluctuates by like one space,
Yeah.
year over year. But it's a very, very significant issue in America in all parts of the country. So I think that, putting on my more advocate volunteer hat,
Hmm.
um, training everybody to be more versed in like recognizing the warning signs of suicide is super important, because in a lot of cases, you might have an individual who is not going to be caught in the safety net, like by a mental health professional necessarily, or like they're not going to have an opportunity to cross paths with somebody with professional training like in time to intervene in their situation. And it might be a peer or a family member or a colleague or a friend who is in a much better position to have a heart-to-heart conversation, like really gain their trust, and or even just be able to have enough experience with that person to recognize when they're acting abnormally,
Hmm.
and that there's an opportunity to step in before something tragic happens.
Yeah. Um, in the time that you've spent working in these associations, and volunteering, and then starting on the sort of documentary side of things, have you seen, like personally seen, change in terms of awareness and conversation and training and things like that?
Yeah, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, and this also could perhaps be a good segue into talking about ketamine stuff as well.
Hmm.
But what you do see really is that there is a huge increase in the amount of people who are accessing mental health resources and are, say, for example, like in therapy.
Hmm.
Um, that's like something that has really grown quite a lot in recent years. I recently was reading an article showing that like the use of mental health services since 2019 has jumped by about 40%.
Well,
And and in the United States, like it translates to about like 1 in every 5 people, which is obviously like a very, very significant number. However, the flip side of that is that the outcomes for a lot of people for mental health are actually strangely like getting worse in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. And there's a lot of competing theories as to why that might be happening. Like there is one argument that says that there's more awareness around it, which means that the reporting is just getting more accurate. It doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily mean that like it's getting worse. I think that's not a proven theory at all.
Yeah.
But that is sort of one argument for it. But I think that's kind of the challenge that a lot of people are seeing and trying to address right now, which is that, the existing models that people have access to for treating mental health are not necessarily working as well as we hope they would. That's not to say that they don't work, and I don't want that to be misunderstood, because I think that people should absolutely pursue a lot of the sort of like more conventional approaches. Like I do personally really strongly believe in, conventional psychotherapy and psychiatry. But I think there is a feeling, even among the practitioners of those different modalities, that, the efficacy rates like still aren't as high as we want them to be. And there are still a huge number of people who are not having their needs met through those modalities, which is sort of what got me very personally interested in the field of like psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, of which ketamine, falls under,
Yeah.
because that's sort of like considered a newer model for how we might be able to address some of these issues that is demonstrating the potential for like a higher efficacy.
Yeah, and I think probably for some percentage of people in this type of scenario, they probably need something a little bit more radical, what would seem radical, to get things moving. And just maybe talk therapy or cognitive behavior therapy are a bit too slow to break through the ice for certain percentage of the demographic. Yeah, let's go into some of the exploration that you've looked at with psychedelics and how they've been brought way more to the forefront, even in like the last, I don't know, 3 years. Really, they've really been getting a lot of a lot of people talking about it, but probably more so in the last decade. It's just, I'm very interested in the subject too, because it's something that has existed more or less, other than sort of chemical versions of psychedelics, have existed for ever, right? People have taken psychedelic mushrooms and other compounds for a long time, and some communities and tribes and things that's part of their essence, or their traditions are built around certain psychedelic experiences, like with ayahuasca and things like that. But it's very interesting to me that it has come back to the forefront, or is new to the forefront, and there is a lot of positive research and impact that is coming out of these experiences that people are able to actually do in a controlled setting, and with proper guidance. And I will let you take it away with some of that exploration.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a lot to talk about. I think for me, I initially was drawn into the field of psychedelic therapy very broadly. As you kind of alluded to already, like there are a huge different number of compounds that are falling under that umbrella, and all of them kind of deserve their own unique conversation, because they're not all the same. But the similarities are really just sort of like, these are all a group of compounds that operate on similar pathways, like in the brain, that are used to treat similar forms of sort of like behavioral psychiatric conditions. But each of them kind of has its own specific pros and cons, if you will, like their own use cases, their own, challenges and things that you should be cautious about. I think the reason that I came to really focus on ketamine is that, in a lot of places, like including, the United States and Canada, I believe, like ketamine is really the compound that is the most clear in terms of its legal status. Like ketamine is, for those of you who are not familiar, maybe, like it's been used for a very, very long time legally as an anesthetic drug. So if you go and get your wisdom teeth out or something like that, you're probably being given ketamine to knock you out, like as a general anesthetic. So because of that unique legal status, it's just been able to be more widely available to people and be usable in a lot more different contexts, and therefore it has like a bigger body of evidence and research that is behind it as well. I think a lot of these other compounds are catching up, and someday might be as commonplace, or maybe even more effective in certain cases. But ketamine is kind of the one that is the most widely known and available right now. So that's sort of why I started to focus in on that one. And it also has some very specific ties to suicidality and suicide prevention that I think make it unique among some of the other psychedelics as well.
Yeah, I think that approach is like the one that is most highest efficacy and is probably used most broadly. It's a good place to start.
Sure.
with the experience, like I think you said mostly was focused in New Mexico. Is that right? Where you'd kind of really started diving into that? Is that the right location?
No, that was for the timepiece, the suicide prevention thing. But this is so we did the ketamine documentary that I'm currently working on in Idaho. It's not necessarily like the center of any research or anything that's going on. Like we did choose that place deliberately because we'd originally been talking with a clinic in the Bay Area in San Francisco. But one thing that was really important to us with the film that we're making is like we wanted to work in an area where psychedelics were not already sort of like widely accepted and understood, and we wanted to try to expand the audience for those compounds and really show people living in these more rural, conservative parts of the country, that this was something that was happening there as well, and something that we kind of want to demystify it and make it a little bit less political and try to show that this is something that is like a medically serious compound, and try to steer away from the countercultural baggage that it's kind of been dogged by for a long time.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people too who are just kind of like looking in from the outside and haven't spent any time thinking about it or looking into it, they're just sort of looking at this as like, it's the trippy drug era, especially if you're sort of like of the baby boomer era, lived through the 70s, saw the LSD boom, you saw it be, criminally listed as all of them as Schedule 1 drugs, and then there's massive crackdowns on it. So there is a stigma tied to psychedelics that they're, only hippies are using them, and maybe not understanding the research that's more resurgence, right? Because when things got shut down, research also got shut down at the same time. So to be able to now have some of that going on for a good decade, now we're at the point where it's coming to the forefront, and people are actually able to apply specific doses and kind of trying to work out the playbook for when to apply it and how much to apply and how often. And so it's kind of still in that stage, right? Like even in Idaho, they're sort of figuring it out on the ground, like boots on the ground, trying to figure out what is the right application for each of these things.
Yeah, there's a couple of things there. Just to that last point, like there is an organization that is trying to sort of like push a standard for all this called MAPS, which it's a long name. I'm hopefully going to get it right. I think it's the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's right.
And they're considered the largest nonprofit pharmaceutical company in the world. So like to get a pharmaceutical product through the FDA approval process, it usually costs like something in the ballpark of a billion to several $billion, which is obviously prohibitive for most non-pharmaceutical companies to go through that. So they're actually like one of the first, if not the first, nonprofit entity to actually fundraise enough money to go through that process. And they're actually doing it with MDMA currently. And they are sort of one of the oldest players in the space. They've been around basically since the 70s. And they are trying to kind of create like a formally recognized protocol for how to administer these compounds. And obviously it's a little bit varied depending on which substance you're working with. And there's a lot of reasons why they chose to start with MDMA as the first one, but I think they're hoping to eventually do this with psilocybin and some of these other compounds as well.
Mhm.
But one important thing that you touched on earlier that I want to also comment on, which is the sort of like history of research around psychedelics not being a new thing. That
Mhm.
was like one of the first surprising things I found when I started looking into it, is that like the origins of psychedelic research really began in the 1950s, and it really started, other than, sorry, I will also acknowledge an important thing you said, which is that obviously like indigenous cultures have had a history with psychedelics for like hundreds, if not thousands of years. But
Yeah.
in sort of like the Western world, in like a more modern context, uh, like with LSD, for example, like it was first synthesized by a pharmaceutical company, Sandoz, in the 1950s. And that was like very surprising to me. And knowing that there was essentially like 20 years of like clinical research on psychedelics before the 1970s counterculture
Mhm.
moment that happened that drove it back underground.
Yeah.
And basically that research continued from the 1950s to today. So there's really actually like 70 years of research that's been done on this stuff. But because it was driven into this more underground status, they couldn't go through that formal FDA process to sort of do it in an above board way
Yeah. Or
until
even
about,
fundraising and.
exactly, until about really like 15 years ago or something like that, when it
Mhm.
really had a big resurgence. And so that is a very critical sort of shift in understanding that happened for me when I started looking into it. Um, Now I've lost the train of thought with the question that you were getting
And I
to,
was like,
Ben.
it just, but now with it in certain groups that are using it and actually applying some of this research in the field, like boots on the ground was the term that I use, is that there are people with PTSD and depression and anxiety that are going and in a controlled environment with controlled doses, are being observed, making sure that they're remaining healthy, they're not getting overdosed or anything like that. That some of this research is now happening, like the application is occurring currently, and you've been able to witness
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it varies a little bit by compound. As far as like LSD, psilocybin, things, MDMA, they are not currently legal. They're still controlled substances. And
Mhm.
so all of the use of those compounds is happening at the sort of like clinical trial level. So it's like being done by universities or institutions in a very, very tightly controlled setting
Mhm.
with a very specific set of rules. Ketamine actually falls under a slightly different category because of its legal status. It's technically only FDA approved as an anesthetic. There's only one form of ketamine administration that has like full FDA approval, and that's S-ketamine, which is a nasal spray version of it.
Right.
Um, it operates in a very strange sort of like regulatory gray area, which is called off-label use, which means
Mhm.
that this substance is legal, but the manner in which you're using it is not necessarily FDA approved. That does not make it illegal whatsoever, but it just means that the FDA is saying we haven't necessarily
Signed
seen the
off.
research to say that this is 100%,
Hmm.
um, approved by us, basically.
Right.
I'm sure a professional would say it a little more eloquently than that. But basically, what that means is that there is a little more variation in the way that ketamine is administered. And there are definitely some pros and cons to that. And I think that anyone who's interested in looking into this should really be wary of sort of like how it's being administered and the way in which some organizations are doing it may be more or less effective than others, or maybe better for certain use cases than others. Like the spectrum is pretty broad. There are some companies on the sort of like more mild intervention side that are using basically a pill
Mm.
form of ketamine, like an oral lozenge. That's a pretty low dose, and it has an effect that is more similar to say like an antidepressant, where it's a subperceptual dose and you're taking it more frequently over a longer period of time,
Mm.
and it's building up more gradually. Then there's the nasal spray version, esketamine, and then on the sort of more high dose side, there is ketamine infusion therapy, which is where you're getting like either intramuscular or intravenous injection into the muscle that has a much more pronounced, like, profound dissociative effect. And then there are some people, I'll try to make this brief, but there are some practitioners who do this with the conjunction of psychotherapy while you're under the influence of the compound. And then there are others where you just take the medicine and that's it. And it's just purely sort of the neurochemical effects on the brain that are giving you the benefits. What I was documenting specifically and looking into, and what I think MAPS is really advocating for, is the psychotherapy assisted model. So you are using these compounds while undergoing conventional psychotherapy as sort of like a force multiplier to make that, more traditional intervention more effective. And I think a lot of people are really strongly advocating for that sort of a model for how we use these compounds.
Yeah, that kind of seems like that was going to be my question, is if they're using the two in conjunction. And I think just from, a layman, it makes sense that you would at least try to do both at the same time. Like if there's benefit from both, which is, that's what the research is trying to show, that if you could do them both cohesively, that it would have maybe a greater effect. But it's pretty fascinating that just taking ketamine, and let's stick to that example, just having that on its own with no additional sort of support or guidance would still have a positive effect, and almost like a rewiring the brain type of thing, which that's maybe not what it does at all, but that's just,
it does.
It does have that sort of effect on people.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that there's still, like, it's funny to talk about because it has been around for a very long time, but again, because of all the cultural, political factors, like a lot of the sort of most conventional processes of research are still kind of unfolding in real time right now. So there is still sort of like a big need for more, like phase 3 clinical trials and things like that to be completed. I actually did a quick search. There's a website called clinicaltrials.gov, which tracks all the different ongoing clinical trials, and you can, search by compound, and there's currently 557 active studies involving ketamine infusion alone that are going on. So I think we're just on the cusp of like a huge body of information really being available on this stuff. But we can get into sort of like the mechanics of it, but I think there are competing views as to like which of these forms of administration is the most effective and for which conditions. I've seen some research that is funded by organizations that have a vested interest in this outcome, but there are some studies that have shown that the low dose pill is more effective than the infusion version, and I've also seen studies that say the opposite. So I think in the next few years we'll get a little bit of a better but regardless, both of those modalities have shown higher efficacy than like traditional antidepressants and like that model. So we're still in early days, but I think in the near term we should be getting more definitive evidence about which modalities are best for which use cases.
Yeah, especially if there are 500 independent studies going on at the same time, that even if there is contradictory studies being done, we'll at least ideally get the best information out by being able to compare the two side by side. Not me personally, someone else will definitely have lots to do to break all of those down. And I think another good thing, maybe a stigma to break or to at least talk about, is the dependence of these types of substances, because with a lot of like SSRIs and just general antidepressants, there is it's a bit of a model that requires dependency. Once most people get on an SSRI, I don't know the exact stat on this, but I think most people are on it for life, or at least for a long period of time. And with let's stick with ketamine, there's and confirm this or not, a low risk of dependency. There obviously are some risks. There are some personalities and situations where people could become, addicted to something like that. But I think that's the point of why being done through schools, why it is so stringent, because their vested interest is finding the best efficacy for application, and they don't want things to get out of control like they did with LSD in the 70s or late 60s. They want to be able to show like this thing works. There's low or no dependence on it, and it doesn't necessarily take years of therapy to get to a result. It may take 1 to 5 sessions, somewhere in that range, if that's correct.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to talk about there. I mean, I think just on that last point,
I'm throwing chum out, and you're just
I'm doing my best to like whack all the malls that are jumping up. But yeah, I think that the feeling is that typically this is a modality that you want to administer over a concentrated period of time. Like the hope is not that this becomes something that you are using on an ongoing basis, at least not with the frequency that you would be using something like an antidepressant. I have seen, and this varies a lot depending on like which modality, like which compound you're talking about, but a lot of people, like a standard protocol for something like ketamine would be 6 sessions over the course of like 6 weeks or 2 to 3 months or something like that. And then I think 30% of people will like never do it again. And then for others, they might get a booster session, once a month or even less frequently than that, sometimes once a year, just to kind of maintain some of those neurochemical benefits. But, the idea is not that this is something that you're doing all the time. Yeah, exactly. And then, there are other compounds that I've seen examples of, because substance abuse is like something that is a big use case for psychedelics, ironically to some people perhaps, but even the person who was the founder of AA felt that like psychedelics were the future of treating substance abuse and dependency.
And he had used psychedelics to get off of alcohol, right?
Yeah, I believe so. It was, again, sort of happening concurrently with like very early psychedelic research, but so I've seen some use cases, for example, where like someone who's addicted to opioids, like very, very seriously addicted to opioids, will do a session of psychedelic therapy. This is using a compound called ibogaine, which is a slightly lesser known one from Africa. And they were able to essentially like become completely independent of using opioids, but they did ibogaine therapy like once a month. And, they even would comment directly like that they, received some criticism from people that, you're just switching one dependency for another. And their response was like, it's a hell of a lot better to do ibogaine once a month than it is to be using opioids like every single day.
Yeah.
And just the ability to sort of like live a very like prosperous life is dramatically different between those two things.
Yeah, you could, side by side, it would be a very different person, someone who's completely addicted to opioids and maybe, not living a life really at all, versus someone who has been able to break through. And the sort of stories that I've heard with that is usually, like with ibogaine, it's usually within a session of doing it, that it just kind of snaps them out of it, in a non-medical terms, snaps them out of that headspace that they're in and lets them sort of look at what they're doing and dissect it and take a step back and then start to make better, judgment calls and stop using them or move away from them.
Yeah, I think that, personally, I think that there's been more evidence showing that it takes like a couple sessions to really get the maximum benefits. I think there certainly are stories of people who like have one session and have a profound change, but I think it's helpful also
more so
to
what
like
I meant
kind
is
of
like, more so what I meant is it just like it was enough to just like shift for them, and then they could take a more sort of steady process to get rehabilitated off of an opioid.
Yeah, I think the reason I say that though is because there is so much excitement around psychedelics that I think sometimes we can be a little bit hyperbolic or like embellish the possibilities a little bit. And I think it's better to take a slightly more like sober approach, no pun intended, to it, just to kind of show that like this isn't a panacea. It's not a silver bullet. Like there
Yeah.
are certain people who should not go down
Yeah.
this road. Like there are certain conditions for which it's actually like unhelpful to use psychedelics, and that's why the approach that is being pushed by MAPS, as well as a lot of these other like clinical settings, is really like in a clinical context where you are being closely monitored by professionals. It's not something that you should do at home. In fact, a lot of people who are
Right.
pushing for medical legalization are kind of like anti-recreational use and anti-recreational legalization because of this history of the 1970s and fearing
Yeah.
that people are going to go out and do stupid things, and that's going to cause blowback to people who are
New
actually
stigmas.
using this in a really important like medically assisted context.
Right. Yeah, that makes total sense to me that they would, and it's not even a control thing. It's just that if it really works, you want to be able to use it for as long as possible and not have situations, arise that are taking away from the quality of the treatment that it might.
And the trust. I think that's the other big thing, is like eroding people's trust in these compounds is like the most important thing that they're trying to avoid.
Right. And I think this is right, whether you've heard this or not. I think with MAPS, they do a more thorough like intake and background check, obviously, because they're clinicians, they're going to do that anyway. But they're looking for common traits that may lead to more issues by taking psychedelic compounds.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was sort of the model that was being followed at the clinic that I was working with. They're like the practitioner I was working with also works with MAPS and has like done some of the clinical trials with MAPS, and they are really sort of like the leader in the space. I mean, the main thing that they try to screen for with most psychedelics is issues surrounding like psychosis, because there are some researchers. There's like this really famous researcher, Robin Carhart Harris, who formerly was at Imperial College in London and then moved to, I believe he's at UCSF now, who created this theory of psychedelics being on this. He was categorizing states of consciousness on the spectrum between essentially what he described as like low entropy states and high entropy states. So a low entropy state being something where you're kind of stuck in a rut. You're kind of just always cycling around, like circling the same drain, so to speak. And that would be something like depression, anxiety, where you're kind of just stuck on this repetitive loop of I'm not good enough, I can't do this, I'm afraid of this, so on and so forth. And then a high entropy state would be something like schizophrenia, where you have so much chaos and so much state change that you don't really know what is real and what is not real or normal or abnormal. And his theory on psychedelics is that they actually boost entropy. So if you're on a high entropy side of the spectrum, it will push you further in that direction, which is obviously very harmful. It can trigger psychotic episodes, so on and so forth. But if you're on the low entropy end of the spectrum with something like PTSD, treatment resistant depression, it can kind of move you back towards baseline by breaking you out of some of those ruts that you're getting stuck in.
Right.
And those really deeply ingrained, mental pathways that kind of become habits, it can help you kind of bust out of those.
Right. And one group that you were, like in Idaho, you were with firefighters a lot, right? So, but was there more PTSD sort of workspace trauma that they were working through and using it for that application on that sort of low end entropy side of things?
Yeah, absolutely. The subject that we followed for our documentary was using ketamine to treat PTSD specifically, which is it's really the two main use cases are PTSD and treatment resistant depression. And among first responders specifically, they experience both of those things as much as 5 times higher than like the general population. So it is really prevalent within those communities. And so, this is like a modality that is really garnering a lot of conversation within those groups of people. Law enforcement, military veterans are very similar. And in fact, sort of like what really caused the biggest amount of political change around psychedelics, and this was a very deliberate strategy by MAPS was they actually worked first with like combat veterans,
Right.
because they knew that there's a lot of bipartisan support and interest for helping with veteran mental health.
Hmm.
And so they started working with combat veterans, with MDMA specifically,
Yeah.
on the issue of PTSD, to show how effective it could be.
Yeah. That was the first time I had heard about maps and with using like working with military veterans specifically, and it's such a tough, like the group are doing such a job that is so important, and then to see them leave their jobs and not have necessarily the support that they need around subjects that are quite polarizing is a tough sort of egg to crack, where they need the help, they need the system of support that to be there. And so for like maps to lead the way with that, and to start to really come up with some solutions that can be applied more or less across the board for people who are in those situations, is like such a game changer.
Yeah, absolutely true.
Um, with the fellowship through Stanford, so you've just been awarded that like a couple months ago, right?
Yeah, it was in November.
And so what will you pursue under that fellowship?
So the umbrella of that is, it's the Western Media Fellowship, and it's through a specific organization at Stanford called the Bill Lane Center for the American West, which really studies the American West, as like a broader region that they define as everything west of the 100th meridian, which is roughly like the west side of the Dakotas, really pushing into that mountain west territory. And for them, that encapsulates the United States, Mexico, and Canada, like Western Canada as well. So I guess in Canada, that would probably be starting at
Basically
about like
Winnipeg.
west, yeah, a little bit west of Winnipeg, probably.
Yeah.
And so they kind of are looking at that whole part of North America, basically, and trying to assess the regional trends, and sort of the challenges facing that part of the continent. And so I was awarded the fellowship, specifically for research into mental health and the way that mental health is disproportionately impacting the American West. Obviously, the work that I'm doing, building off the Time article on suicide being a really driving problem specific to that region, but also just ways that we can be working to sort of address and provide, better modalities and interventions for trying to improve upon that, and also policy things that we can do to try to improve this, like on a more political basis and at a larger scale as well.
And using or working with Stanford, what kind of maybe like resources and support will they help provide you to make sure that you can get sort of deeper into the subject?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still exploring that. It's very early days. The two areas that have sort of emerged already that I'm going to be having conversations about in the coming weeks are within their sort of like School of Psychiatry, which, there are people who are there who, like I mentioned, have developed toolkits on how to basically like tell stories in safer ways that do not increase risk of suicide, which is, an unfortunate side effect of the way that a lot of people talk about these issues. There have been some famous examples of like movies and TV shows that have covered the issue of suicide that have actually increased suicides. So, they're trying to kind of put out better guidelines for people who are spreading those kind of messages. So I'm working with some experts within that part of the university that have done a lot of research into this to kind of learn more about that, and learn more about, how to sort of conduct research within this area that can be useful for, scientists and people who are a little more qualified than I am to figure this out. And then the Bill Lane Center specifically has a real emphasis on like public policy. And I think the like resident scholar who's running that school is really an expert on like Western policy. And so really working with them, my focus is going to be how do we sort of work on a call to action or like a way to sort of improve upon this problem, not just recognize it, but figure out pathways to make it better. And whether that's through advocating for public policy or educating the public to advocate for public policy, but sort of like more tangible solutions that we can work towards on how to improve upon some of these issues.
So with that part of Stanford, they're not specifically looking into the subject you're looking in. You're going to bring in an aspect of the sort of big picture that they're trying to tell, and making it part of the story of the 100th meridian west of North America. So this will be like an in addition to other topics and subjects that they're doing research on and have done on, this is going to be an additional facet to that program.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's a big reason why they selected my application, honestly, is because a lot of the work they've done in the past has really focused on more economic and environmental factors, and sort of like the connection between a changing environment and the economies of these places. But I think what I tried to propose in my application is that these sort of negative mental health consequences are directly tied to those subjects as well. And it's almost sort of like the end result of, these sort of negative changes to the environment and the economies of these places that are causing these negative outcomes for public health. And so I think, the hope is to try to tie those different topics together.
Yeah, in a sense, you're showing the aftermath of the sort of like economic, like steeplechase of economics, where, like we talked about earlier, is like a boom town that is busted, and what's left behind is the subject that you're going into.
Totally. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, let's wrap up on that, man. It was great conversation with you, and love going into a lot of the details of subject that I'm really interested in, and then another subject that I think more people should know about and be aware of. And I just wanted to cover, like, the documentary that you are working on is kind of set to release when?
It should be coming out. Our hope right now is end of March, and we can provide some more information on that soon. We just had some very exciting news on that I can't quite share yet, because we should be signing the contract sometime
We're
this
not
week.
getting the exclusive today.
Unfortunately not. It's probably days away, unfortunately, but it will be in sort of like a major news outlet, which we're pretty stoked about. And
Nice.
Those details should be coming soon. But yeah, end of March is what we're hoping for the release of that.
Cool. And I think we can circle back around that and have another discussion, and especially maybe just after it releases or just before, so people are up to date on any new stuff that's they can look for in the documentary, and where they can find it when it's ready to release and be available to the public.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if you do any show notes or anything, but I also have some links that I can share from some of the sort of things that we talked about in the podcast today.
Yeah, that's perfect. We'll add all those in the show notes, and any other sort of like helplines. I know there's specific ones in the US versus in Canada around suicide. We'll provide any guidance and links that will give people help that they need if they're listening to this and they need it.
Yeah, actually, can I say something about that really quick?
Please
I'm really
do.
glad you brought that up. In the United States, they, as of a year or so ago, they've implemented a national crisis line, which is a 3-digit code now, which is 988. And the one thing I like to add to that is that a lot of people don't realize that you can call these hotlines, even if you yourself are not the person who's in crisis. But if you know somebody who's in crisis, or you're concerned about a friend and you want to learn how to be better equipped to deal with that situation, you yourself can also call these crisis lines and sort of ask for guidance on how to navigate, a crisis situation, or something that you're afraid is going to develop into a crisis situation, which is something that I think more people could take advantage of that they might not be aware of already.
Perfect.
Awesome.
Thanks for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me, Joe. I appreciate it.
Okay, we'll chat soon.
All right, have a good one.
Thanks everybody for listening to the episode. If you enjoyed it, please like, share, and follow the podcast to get notifications when new episodes drop. Each week, I send out my routine report through Substack. In this weekly email, I'm sharing what I've been learning, listening to, and reading, as well as keeping you up to date with stuff coming down the pipeline, from new training programs to podcast and Instagram posts and everything in between. Click the show note link to subscribe and stay informed. And a quick reminder about the Bioptimizer discount. The products I've been using from them have been an absolute game changer for me and many others. Remember, you can get 10% off your order when you use the code 3phase10. That's the number 3, PHASE10 on any of their products. And until the next episode, stay well.